Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to paint these watercolor gift tags. They're really simple and quick and perfect for any kind of gifting that you are doing this holiday season. So let's get into it. I'm using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper and my squares are 2.5 by 3 inches. And so the first card I'm going to do is a very simple pine branch, and I feel like anytime you can do pine needles, it really just brings that feeling of winter and the holidays almost immediately. So I'm using the very tip of my brush. I'm using very light pressure. I'm starting off with a really light green and just doing these really quick random strokes in all different sizes, in all different lengths, and I'm kind of clumping them together to look like the different offshoots in a pine branch. Now I'm going to paint the actual branch of our pine branch, and so I'm making sure that my strokes are short and connected to these little clumps of pine needles. It's also really realistic looking to have offshoots that maybe don't have any pine needles connected. Just keeping them nice and short and quick makes it look really organic. And to finish off the pine branch, I'm just using a darker pigment of green to paint more pine needles that act as contrast and pine needles that are kind of in shadow. It really helps the painting pop to add that difference in color to those pine needles. And for the next tag, I'm going to paint some berries and leaves that go together. And so I'm just painting these berries in a simple circle shape, leaving some white space for kind of a little highlight so that they don't look flat, and then connecting them together with a little brown stem. So now I've mixed together a really pretty blue-green color on my palette that I feel pairs really nicely with this bright berry that we've painted. And I'm just placing the leaves around the berries, kind of just wherever they feel right to me, not necessarily in any particular order. And I'm using a 2-stroke method where I'm putting light pressure on the ends of the leaf, heavy pressure on the middle of the leaf, and leaving white space in the middle to signify the veining of the leaf. For the next tag, we're going to paint a pine cone. And really, pine cones are a lot more simple than you might think. You start with some really small shapes towards the top, and then you stagger these little half circle shapes around until you get the pine cone shape that you want, which is pretty fun because pine cones can be a large variety of different shapes. So once you're happy with the overall shape of your pine cone, you're going to take a darker pigment and do some shadowing while everything is still wet within those shapes you've already created, and then also do some light, thin shapes around the base of the pine cone. And pine cones are found with pine needles, so on the sides of my pine cone, I am adding some pine needles in the same technique that I used to paint the pine branch. So really thin strokes with the tip of my brush. I'm starting with light green first and then moving to dark green for the contrast. For this next tag, I'm doing a small little tree, not quite a Charlie Brown tree, but in that very similar feeling to it. It's just going to be fuller. So I'm using the very tip of my brush to create these very small strokes for these pine branches. And I'm making sure the branches point upward and that everything is kind of clumped together into individual branches so you can see them separately. We don't want it to be one big blob of these tiny strokes. So you want the branches to come out individually and have enough little pine needle markings on each branch, and then you want it to be more full towards the bottom. Unless you're doing a Charlie Brown tree, then you can have it as sparse as you want. So I'm imagining some type of blanket or tree skirt around the bottom of this tree, and so I'm making these really soft strokes, but I'm making sure to leave white space in between so it looks like the ruffle on this blanket. or that it's folded up around the base of this tree. And I started with a really light wash and then went in and added a little bit of a darker pigment of red to bleed into that blanket. And at the end, I'm going through with a darker pigment of green to add some contrast to those pine branches. So I felt like we needed a little bit more red in our holiday gift cards that we were painting. And so I decided to paint a candy cane, which is one of my favorite parts about the holidays. So I wanted to start with this bow on the candy cane. So I'm painting out the shape of this bow in red, and then I will paint the stripes around the bow. So you can't see it very well, but I have a light sketch of my candy cane going through the middle of the bow so that I know where I'm putting these stripes. And my inspiration for this candy cane came from a vintage Christmas card that I found. And that's why maybe the stripes aren't what you would normally see on a candy cane, but I just loved the quirky vintage feel of the way the stripes laid, and so I went for it. And because I took inspiration from a vintage card, it also had these beautiful green stripes in the middle, and I totally went for that since our whole theme is the red and green today. I also thought it would be nice to define the white spaces on the candy cane by adding a shadow around the candy cane. So I'm just using a very light wash of Payne's Gray, and I'm just lightly outlining the candy cane and then using water to really soften that edge. So it gives a nice definition to the candy cane, a little bit of shadow, but we don't want a really stark, harsh line. For the next card, I wanted to paint a group of trees, almost like a little forest, and do a really fun technique where you wash across the bottom and they bleed onto the bottom of the paper. And so I'm first starting off with painting the trees. I'm doing a very similar technique to what I was doing with pine needles, very short, quick strokes with the very tip of my brush. But before these dry, I'm going to go through with a really wet brush and wash over the bottom of these trees so that they start to bleed into the bottom of my paper. And then I'm going to continue to paint more trees, wash along the bottom of them, and just let everything bleed together. And to get even more bleeding, I am just dabbing in some color into that wash across the bottom to strengthen the pigment. And then to finish off, I'm using a wet brush to kind of drag down the color to reach the bottom of the paper so that there's not a harsh line. For this tag, I wanted to do one more tree, and I really wanted to do like a snowy tree. And so as I'm painting this, it's kind of a negative painting where I'm imagining that there are big clumps of snow on this tree. So I'm doing little bits of green here and there, and then leaving giant areas of white space to represent big patches of snow on this tree. And so the way to make that more realistic looking is really stagger your patches, have some green in the middle. Most of the green should connect together, and then the patches of white shouldn't be too patchy either, or they won't look like a big clump. Once I'm satisfied with the shape of my tree, I'm going to add a stump to the bottom, and then I'm going to use some Payne's Gray to very lightly give the illusion of snowbanks and hills of snow around this snowy tree. For this tag, I'm going to paint a wreath, and I'm going to use 3 elements that we've already painted today. And the first one is berries. So we've already painted berries, and I'm just going around and kind of randomly in a circle, placing patches of berries together, 2 and 3, some single berries, making sure to leave white space in the center for that highlight. And I'm just imagining where my wreath shape is around in a circle and just trying to place them randomly, organically, make sure they look nice and spaced out. So the second element is a bow for our wreath, and so I'm just painting it right at the bottom of the wreath in the center, and I'm painting each element of the bow individually and then making sure to leave some white space, and that way you can see each section of the bow without it being one big blob of red. And then the last element is the pine needles. So again, just doing quick short strokes all the way around, leaving white space around the berries, but kind of hugging them so that they all look like they're combined together to create a wreath. To finish off our mistletoe, I'm just making sure that each of these little berries has a little stem that comes off of it so that we know that it is attached to this mistletoe sprig. So for the last tag, I'm doing a candle that is lit with holly berries at the base, and this turned out to be my absolute favorite tag of the whole bunch. So I'm starting by using a very light tan brown color and just creating a long cylinder shape for the candle. And then at the base, without touching the candle, I'm painting some holly berries. Again, leaving that white space in the center for the highlight. So it can be tricky to get that holly leaf shape that is so specific to holly leaves, right? So I trace it out and then I fill it in, and that really helps me get the exact shape that I want. And then once I get in a couple of very distinct holly leaf shapes, then I kind of do little bits here and there that still look like the holly leaf shape, but we don't have to be as specific once we get a few very obvious leaves painted. And at this point, because the candle is almost dry, I am totally okay with a little bit of bleeding from that holly leaf into our candle. I think it makes a nice transition from the leaves to the candle. It looks more natural. And so I just continue to add holly leaves around the berries until I feel like all of the spaces have been filled and it just looks. I used a brown color and it was perfect because the candle was not quite dry at the top either, and so it had a lovely amount of bleeding just right at the top. I also used a light brown to kind of paint a little lump on the side as if the wax was melting down the side of the candle. Now I'm using a very bright yellow for the flame, and just use the very tip of your brush. You can leave white space and make sure that you're keeping the flame around the very tip of the wick. And while the yellow is still wet, you can drop some orange in so that it bleeds up into the flame and adds dimension. And now you have 10 beautiful gift tags that you can use however you like. On this one I wrote "To Mom." You can hole punch them, you can tape them onto gifts, you can write a note, or you could even paint these ideas bigger and give them out as Christmas cards with a family picture. Thank you so much for being here with me today as we painted some holiday gift tag ideas. I hope you use some of these. Let me know in the comments down below if you do, and I hope you and your family have a happy holiday season. See you next time. Bye.